Recently, I covered the Soviet aircraft carrier Minsk. That was an unfortunate ship, not so much for her service history, but for what happened to her after that. From Chinese theme park to a fire burning her out. Today's topic is, if anything, more unfortunate. After all, at least Minsk was completed and saw service. The same cannot be said for Ulyanovsk, the closest the Soviet Navy, and arguably the Russian Navy, ever got to a proper supercarrier. This ship was actually laid down and almost reached halfway to completion. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on who you ask, that never went anywhere. Ulyanovsk would be the largest and most prominent victim of the Soviet Union's collapse, at least when it comes to the Soviet and Russian navies. That makes this ship interesting for two reasons: her ultimate fate and the break in Soviet doctrine that she represented. With that in mind, let's start with the background, because there's not really any service to talk about. One of the important things to keep in mind in this regard is that the Soviets actually did have some interest in aircraft carriers, and had for some time. This interest extended at least as far back as the Second World War, and even a bit before then. There were, after all, some rumblings of completing the incomplete battlecruiser Ismail into a carrier in 1925. That would likely have resulted in something akin to Lexington, if smaller and slower. Although I've never seen any real plans in that regard, if any ever existed. Regardless, it shows the Soviets were in fact interested in aircraft carriers. However, this plan and the later ones went nowhere, for various reasons. From Stalin's fascination with big, brutish battleships, to the pivot towards submarines and light surface forces after he was out of the picture. Because of this, the Soviets went through a couple stages of aviation ship. Moskva was the first, although this was a helicopter carrier, or helicopter cruiser to the Soviets. The Moskvas were intended as large anti-submarine warfare platforms. They could not operate fixed-wing aircraft. So the next Soviet experiment in naval aviation came with the Kievs in the 1970s. I've covered two of these before in the form of Minsk and Baku, with the latter one seeing a second life as a proper, if small, aircraft carrier, as INS Vikramaditya of the Indian Navy. Now the Kievs are commonly called aircraft carriers, and in fairness, they did operate fixed-wing aircraft in the form of the Yak-38 vertical takeoff and landing fighter. However, these ships were still less a proper carrier and more a really big, heavy aviation cruiser. This was partially a legal fiction to transit the Bosporus, but partially a fact of the design. The hitting power on Kiev was the ship's missile systems, not the aircraft. At least if you were engaging a surface target. As this slow grind towards a proper aircraft carrier continued, the Soviets had a bit of a diversion. In the 1970s, as the Kievs were entering service, the Soviets looked to a large nuclear-powered supercarrier, a proper aircraft carrier for fleet defense, as well as offensive actions. This was the Orel project, which went through two major variations, Project 1160 and Project 1153. Both were interesting, roughly the displacement of a Forrestal or Kitty Hawk, but nuclear-powered to their conventional counterparts. Exact details beyond that point aren't entirely clear, as is often the case with Soviet projects that went nowhere. They would probably have carried about 50 to 60 aircraft. You'll often see a navalized version of the MiG-23 proposed for the airwing. To quote the biggest supporter of the project, Defense Minister Grechko, "Why are you splitting hairs here? Make an aircraft carrier like the Americans have with that kind of aircraft fleet." Orel was fully intended to be an American-style supercarrier for the most part. Even here, however, the ship still carried missiles in the form of vertical launch tubes beneath the flight deck, again to circumvent restrictions on aircraft carriers leaving the Black Sea. It would have been a touch silly looking at this ship in hindsight. However, it came to nothing because Comrade Forrestal was ultimately cancelled. Exactly why varies on who you ask. The most common answer is the ship was too expensive. Alternatively, I've seen another answer floating about in the form of politics. The patron of the ship passing away and his successor stopping the project. Either way, you can play around with the ship in sea power, I believe, if that's your kind of thing. In any event, this design did have some influence moving forward. While Orel was dropped in 1978, the overall design provided a lot of influence on Ulyanovsk, as well as the actual first Soviet aircraft carrier, Kuznetsov. In the latter case, the missiles beneath the flight deck, which is why that ship is also technically classified as a really big aviation cruiser. As for Ulyanovsk, well, this ship was a more direct successor to Orel, including again the flight deck missiles. By the time this ship was coming about in the mid-1980s, the Soviets had shifted around their doctrine a bit. Though in light of its predecessor, this might be more like they reverted back to what Grechko had argued for. Aircraft carriers were starting to be seen as a key defensive aspect of Soviet doctrine, although it might be more accurate to call it an active defense, citing a Naval War College article which itself cites a Soviet naval officer. I do not oppose that, i.e. defensive doctrine, but the question naturally arises, is the destruction of convoys transporting troops and military equipment to the European continent or to Asia for the purpose of conducting military operations against us to be considered as defensive or offensive? So you see a certain appeal for an aircraft carrier as a deterrent and an active defense, in addition to fleet air defense, something that the Yaks on Kiev were already being used for. Now, this was by no means a universal opinion, but it was enough of a concern to justify the construction of a supercarrier, in addition to Kuznetsov and Varyag. The same articles also cite the Falkland Wars as an influence, particularly the success and failings of the British carrier force. The success of keeping the Argentinians at bay, but also the issues with relying entirely on vertical takeoff and landing aircraft. Of course, those articles are from Western authors with limited information. They originated in the early 1990s. Unfortunately, detailed information on the lead up to Ulyanovsk is difficult to find. Another article, if a less formal one, gives the following information: that this project was developed based on Orel in 1984, that the sketch design was approved in 1986, and work began to build the ship. Design work continued until 1987, with the ship finally laid down towards the end of 1988. Even with this, a lot of the background remains guesswork. Access to Soviet archives was never great. And in today's political climate, well, I don't think I need to elaborate on that. That aside, let's look at what actually came from all of this, which was, to use the Soviet designation, Project 1143.7. This ship was designed in the mid-1980s and does have a certain resemblance to American supercarriers, at least in overall layout. Not from copying, at least not directly, but simply because form follows function, with one notable exception in regard to the similarities. Just as with Kuznetsov, Project 1143.7 had a ski jump. Before I touch on that, however, let's take a look at the rest of the design features. While details are sparse and often contradictory, this would have been roughly equivalent with smaller American supercarriers, around 60 to 65,000 tons at the standard loading, with this going up to around 75 to 80,000 tons when fully loaded, basically around a Kitty Hawk in terms of displacement. Now for the other parts of the design. This came out to a length of 321 meters or 1,054 feet with a beam of 83.9 meters or 275 feet. The flight deck, meanwhile, was 75 meters or 248 feet wide. As mentioned before, this included a ski jump. Much like on Kuznetsov, this would have enabled aircraft to carry heavier loads on a shorter takeoff distance. Unlike her smaller counterpart, Project 1143.7 also had two catapults, fitted to the angled flight deck. This flight deck was serviced by three elevators, one ahead and one behind the island on the starboard side, with a third at the rear of the angled deck on the port side. That flight deck and the hangar beneath it supported an airwing of around 70 aircraft. Again, sources can and will differ. On the other hand, the composition of the airwing seems to be pretty consistent, largely focused on Su-33s or MiG-29Ks. Looking to Kuznetsov, it's fairly likely the Su-33 would have been the focus, specifically around 44 of those fighters, with 6 Yak-44 early warning aircraft similar to the Grumman E-2 Hawkeye, in addition to 18 Kamov helicopters. For most aircraft carriers, this would be where the offensive punch came to an end. Not so with this one. As I said, the Soviets fitted the ship with anti-ship missiles beneath the flight deck. In this case, 12 of the powerful P-700 Granite missiles, the same missiles carried by Kirov. Defensive weaponry isn't quite as clear. It again varies on source. The ship carried either 6 or 8 30mm AK-630 guns, as well as 8 CADS-N1 close-in weapons systems, a twin 30mm gun, with longer range defense coming from 3 S-90 surface-to-air missiles. That rounds off the weaponry, which just leaves speed. While the ship never sailed, this was intended to be around 30 knots, on 4 nuclear reactors powering 4 steam turbines, for a total of 280,000 shaft horsepower through 4 shafts. And with that bringing us to the end of the design, we can return to history, such as it is. There isn't much to note here. Project 1143.7 was laid down on November 25, 1988, under the name Ulyanovsk, the birthplace of Lenin, previously named Simbersk. The current name was given in honor of Lenin, or rather, Vladimir Ulyanov. As for the ship, Ulyanovsk would be built in Nikolaev, or modern Mykolaiv in Ukraine. As you can probably guess, for a ship laid down in 1988, the construction didn't get far. Ulyanovsk was about 40% complete when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. Neither the Ukrainians nor the Russians had the funding or political will to complete the ship. Instead, she would be scrapped over the course of 1992, bringing an end to the only Soviet supercarrier ever laid down, and to this date, the only Russian supercarrier as well. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.